Adrian, have you heard from the chair as to whether or not he'd be able to attend today?
I have not heard from the chair.
All right, I'll just give you a minute to get everyone in
Okay.
and go ahead and convene the meeting. Just let me know when you're ready to go, Adrian.
Okay. Just waiting for a few more people to show up.
As this is a study session or a special meeting, do we need, well, as this is a retreat, do we need a quorum to continue?
We do need to take roll for the stipend purposes.
Got it. So let's give people another 2 minutes
Yes.
in that case. Welcome, everybody. For those just joining us, we're just giving folks maybe another minute or two to get online and join us before we convene the meeting. I'm sure you saw the alert on your Zoom, but please note this meeting is being recorded. So anything you do or say may be transmitted into the recording, and just be aware of that. Thank you.
Okay. I'm ready to begin when you are.
Adrian, and in the interest of respecting everyone's time, for those of us who are able to get here by now, let's go ahead and begin. We'll start with the roll call, and I will turn it over to our clerk of the board to go ahead and conduct that.
Yes. Alameda County. Alameda County. Albany. Albany. Berkeley. Berkeley. Dublin. Dublin. Fremont. Fremont. Hayward.
Present.
Livermore. Newark.
Here.
Piedmont.
Present.
Pleasanton.
I apologize. I'm an alternate. I'm not sure if my primary is going to be here, but I'm from Pleasanton.
I will note that. Thank you.
Thank you.
San Leandro.
Present.
Tracy.
Present.
Union City.
Present.
Community Advisory Committee. Emeryville.
Present.
And Oakland. We have a quorum.
Very good. Thank you, Mr.
Yes.
Clark. And I just realized that I did not properly introduce the meeting. This is the East Bay Community Energy Special Meeting Board Directors Retreat on Public Policy. Today is Wednesday, June 9th, and the meeting was called to order at 1:34 p.m. by my clock. Adrian will put the correct time in there, I'm sure. So welcome everyone. Now is the time for public comment. I will look to the clerk to see if anyone has submitted a speaker card. And for those who are attending, if you're attending via Zoom and would like to be recognized, please use the raise hand feature. If you are calling in on the phone, please press *9. And in the interest of time, I'm going to limit public comment before the presentation to 1 minute per speaker.
Great. There are no speakers for public comment.
Thank you. Well, that brings us to our informational item. So this is the public policy update, and I don't want to assume who is presenting, but I'm guessing it's Melissa.
That's right. I will be presenting, and several members of my team will be jumping in as relevant.
Great, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, next slide, please, Adrian. So I wanted to start off this afternoon by just introducing you to our public policy team. The team really covers all regulatory and legislative matters on behalf of EBCE. We also cover strategic policy communications. And of course, guided by your direction, we coordinate with our fellow CCAs. And a lot of the work that we do with our CCAs is through our trade association, which is Cca. And then we also work externally with regulators, legislators, and other influential policy stakeholder groups, really across all issues of policy that touch EBCE. So on our team, we have, and everybody on our team is here today. We have several folks on our staff. So we have Febby, and she is a regulatory analyst. She covers a lot of the policy proceedings at EBCE that kind of deal with social policy and equity issues. We have Todd Edmister, and he covers a lot of our rates related cases. And we have Stephanie Tannenhouse, and she covers a lot of our procurement related cases. And then we also have Molly Gilmore, who is a contract management associate. So she is not doing the regulatory function, but she helps EBCE with its contract management functions. She also helps us with compliance, which is a key function for EBCE, of course, and that has a lot of interface with the regulation and with our legislative branch as well. And so that's our internal team. In addition, we have a couple consultants that we work with. Listed here, I have our lobbyists. So every year we get board approval for a lobbying contract, and we are currently contracted with Vitamin Group in Sacramento. And we are also in contract with Ben Palos, who helps draft our e-newsletter and our blog that gets posted every few months or so. In addition, I failed to put on here we also have a compliance consultant that works with us to make sure that we're documenting and complying with all of the regulations that apply to EBCE. Next slide, please. So wanted to introduce Cca, the trade association I mentioned in the last slide. And Cca its mission is really to support the CCAs that are members by creating a legislative and regulatory environment that supports the development and long-term sustainability of CCAs in California. We are a member, as are 22 of the other 23 operating CCAs in California, as well as several emerging CCA communities. You can become a member before you've actually launched. And Cca members now serve upwards of 11 million customers throughout California. So it's grown from a very small operation to a fairly sizable force. We participate in a few ways in Cca. Our team participates in a legislative committee, and there's also a regulatory committee we participate in, as well as a compliance committee. And then of course, Nick is on Cca's board. Next slide, please. So wanted to go through a little bit of the history of CCAs in California for you. So this is a timeline. It was back in 2002 that the legislature passed AB 117, which really enables CCA in California. And the reason for that was actually the energy crisis. CCA was a reaction to the energy crisis. And the idea was that if you enabled communities to procure their own energy, that it could provide more stability to the energy markets than just relying on the investor-owned utilities. So that happened. However, it took quite a while for communities to be ready to launch this new model. San Joaquin Valley Power Authority was the first JPA to be certified, but they did not end up launching. And Marin Clean Energy finally in 2010 ended up launching and becoming the first CCA to serve customers. The next year, SB 790 passed, where the legislature detailed the rights of CCA agencies. There's been a lot that's happened since, particularly in the regulatory space, to define the requirements of CCAs, looking at what the legislature has detailed. And then the Cpuc also passed a code of conduct that really outlined how the utilities needed to interact with the CCAs to ensure fairness and to ensure that that the utilities were not stopping the formation of CCAs or spreading misinformation. And then finally, in 2016, as you know, EBCE formed as a JPA, and then of course we launched to our customers in 2018. Next slide, please. So, of course, we work under our board's jurisdiction as a joint powers authority, but we are also subject to oversight by several state agencies in accordance with state law, and that's because of our role as a load-serving entity. So these, the main agencies that have jurisdiction over us are the California Public Utilities Commission, the Energy Commission, the Air Resources Board, and then I put the California ISO up here, not technically a state agency, but it still has some oversight over our activities. So we're going to go into a deeper dive of each of these agencies and how we work with them. Next slide, please. And actually, I'm going to hand it over to Febby on our team here, who's going to go over the Cpuc, since that's an area that she works quite extensively and is very familiar with.
Sure. Thank you, Melissa. Can you all hear me fine? Okay, awesome. Good afternoon, all. So we think it's very important to highlight the California Public Utilities Commission and their function, as they are a very prominent governing institution in the state of California as it relates to all utilities. And I would say that, most of our work, primarily most of our time is spent responding to the California Public Utilities Commission, also known as the Cpuc or the Commission. And what's important about them is that they regulate the IOUs. So they regulate privately owned electric, natural gas, telecommunications, water, railroad companies such as Pacific Gas and Electric, Southern California Edison. And what is also very important about the Cpuc to note, in which some of my colleagues will go into in more of a deep dive, is that they actually provide jurisdiction over these three proceedings or topics. So that is the resource adequacy proceeding or reliability, renewable portfolio standard, or known as RPS, IRP, or the integrated resource planning. So of course, we are moving forward, or we're in correspondence with our board, you all, in addition to the Cpuc's jurisdiction over these three kind of goals. And then lastly, we wanted to note that the Cpuc, because they do regulate IOUs, it does really impact the work that we do and across the state of California. Next slide, please. Great. So you may ask, who constitutes the Cpuc? And so there are 5 Cpuc commissioners. They are all appointed by the governor and approved by the Senate for staggered 6-year terms. So we have worked with almost all, if not all, of the commissioners in different types of proceedings or cases. And they are listed here to the left. Something to note is that there is an ALJ, an administrative law judge, who oversees each proceeding. So for example, one of the proceedings that I case manage is the COVID-19 customer debt relief proceeding, and there is an ALJ or a judge assigned to this one proceeding. And then the ALJ therefore issues a proposed decision or a PD in accordance to the Cpuc rules. Then the commission, of course, they may issue an alternative proposed decision. What is important to note is that parties such as CalCCA or Ebce, we can respond to the proposed decision. So this is kind of that interaction or that engagement we are having with the Cpuc. And then the commissioners will vote on a proposed decision. And of course, if it's passed, then that becomes the final decision. And these are held scheduled publicly, so folks can join into those meetings. And then another important thing to note is that there are ex partes, which essentially is meetings that we can have with the commissioners to communicate any types of concerns, issues, or potentially things that we support. And then we can move on to the next slide. Yeah, so to holistically understand the Cpuc, there are other branches or arms under the Cpuc. So these are the divisions, and the three we think are notable are Energy Division, the Public Advisor's Office, also known as PAO, and then Cal Advocates, or the Public Advocate's Office. How I like to think of Energy Division is that they're really the staff driving the issues, kind of putting pen to paper. They handle regulation, approval of the rates by IOUs, and advise the commission on energy policy issues. I tend to look at them, or if there are really concrete in the weeds issues, we do a lot of the interfacing or communication with Energy Division staff. And then the two here, Public Advisor's Office, or also known as PAO, they provide procedural information to individuals, community groups who want to participate in these formal proceedings. So at times it can be difficult to navigate the system or the structure. So PAO, they work as a function to assist and educate the public. And then lastly here we have Cal Advocates, and they are an independent organization within the Cpuc, and they work on behalf of utility ratepayers. So oftentimes when I'm working in a proceeding, the Cal Advocates group, they can provide comments or any sort of response to either a proposed decision. And their kind of line of framing is really on behalf of utility ratepayers. And we have also interacted with them in various proceedings. And then next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to pass this back to Melissa for the list of proceedings we're on.
Great. So I just thought it might be helpful to put in this slide representation of the myriad of proceedings that Ebce is a party in and participates in some cases representing ourselves, in other cases in coordination with CalCCA, or in coordination with a group of joint CCAs. So as you can see, there are quite a number of proceedings at the PUC that we have been engaged in. And I kind of grouped it here by procurement related cases, rates related cases, community related cases, distributed energy resource related cases, and kind of restructuring related cases, and miscellaneous. So each of these proceedings is a formal proceeding at the Public Utilities Commission with an assigned commissioner and an administrative law judge. And they can take anywhere from usually 18 to 24 months. There are proceedings that move faster, but less than a year is practically unheard of. There's quite a formal process. It's laid out in the Cpuc's rules of practice and procedure, and subject to the California Administrative Policy Act. So there are many rules that govern how we participate in these proceedings. And so some of our participation is formal in terms of filing comments or testimony or calling witnesses, participating in evidentiary hearings. And then some of our participation is less formal, for example, interacting with Energy Division staff. And then as Feby mentioned, we can also request ex parte meetings with commissioners and their staff. Those are subject to very strict rules about noticing, and there are certain kinds of proceedings when you cannot even request a meeting. So we have to be very careful to make sure that we follow all of those communications rules as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to move on here to the California Energy Commission. And they, unlike the Cpuc, which is headquartered in San Francisco, the CEC is headquartered in Sacramento. And it's really California's primary energy policy and planning agency. Whereas the Cpuc regulates CCAs with respect to RA, RPS, and IRP, the CEC performs a similar regulatory function, oversight function for the municipal utilities. So both agencies are regulating agencies on those topics, but we fall under the Cpuc jurisdiction for those items. But CEC is still very important to what we are doing. For example, they forecast the future energy needs for the state, and a lot of our regulatory requirements are tied to those forecasts. They also set appliance and building efficiency standards, and they work with local governments to enforce those standards. And we also have been working with them on some of those standards on things like the REACH codes. They also provide some market support to renewable technologies and incentives for things like solar electricity systems. And then they also implement the Alternative and Renewable Fuel and Vehicle Technology Program, $100 million a year. And that includes things like funding for EV charging infrastructure. And as you know, EBCE has been awarded a Cal EVIP grant, and those kinds of grants come under funding programs like this. Next slide, please. So similar to the Cpuc, the CEC also has 5 commissioners appointed by the governor and approved by the Senate. CEC, instead of 6-year terms, are 5-year terms. And CEC commissioners also have to represent specific areas of expertise. And so there's 5 commissioners, there's 5 areas of expertise. They are law, environment, economics, science and engineering, and the public at large. And then each CEC proceeding is also overseen by a lead commissioner, and the commissioners vote at their regularly scheduled public meetings, which are held once a month. Next slide, please. What I would say is that the proceedings at the CEC are structured very differently than the Cpuc. They don't have an administrative law judge, and their process, while still structured, is not quite as formal as the Cpuc's process, which is much more adjudicatory, I would say, in nature. The CEC will have rulemakings, and parties can provide comments and attend workshops, but it's not as adversarial in that sense. But we do engage with the CEC in a number of areas. So as I mentioned, the CEC does forecasting for the state. They do the Integrated Energy Policy Report, otherwise known as the IPER. And so they put that out, and that includes demand forecasts, which sets requirements for things like resource adequacy. And then they have the Alternative Renewable Fuel and Vehicle Technology Program, including things like the Cal EVIP grant. They also manage the Power Source Disclosure Program. So once a year, we have to send our customers a power content label that shows where their energy is coming from. And that's in accordance with the CEC regulations and CEC approvals of our label. There's a load management proceeding we're involved in, and a load modification proposal that we've been working with the CEC on as another way for us to get credit for investments in behind the meter distributed energy resources, for example. They also manage the Epic Electric Program Investment Charge Program funds, and then also the REACH codes, which many of our cities have been looking to develop and adopt. Next slide, please. So now we're going to move on to the California Air Resources Board, or CARB. CARB is a lead agency for climate change programs, and they're best known for their overseeing of air pollution control efforts in California. And they are also headquartered in Sacramento. CARB has 14 voting members on the board, as well as 2 ex officio non-voting members who are members of the legislature, one from the Senate and the other from the Assembly. And the voting members are appointed for staggered 6-year terms. We have a couple areas of intersection with CARB at the moment, particularly in transportation electrification, and then in low carbon fuel standards credits. So not as much interface as with the other agencies, but these are still areas that are very important to EBCE and to our programs, and to ensuring that we have adequate funding and monetization of those programs. Next slide, please. So next, I'm going to talk about the California Independent System Operator, or Kaiso. Kaiso's job is to provide open and non-discriminatory access to the bulk of the state's wholesale transmission grid, supported by a competitive energy market and comprehensive infrastructure planning efforts. And they're headquartered in Folsom. As I mentioned earlier, Kaiso is not actually a state agency. They are set up as a nonprofit public benefit corporation, and they're led by a board of governors. But the key thing to note is that those governors are 5 members appointed by the California governor and confirmed by the Senate. The board of governors typically meets 1 or 2 times a month, and that's where they can review and approve policies and grid planning and market design changes. We're also quite engaged at Kaiso, both on our own initiative as well as with the Cca. And some of the stakeholder, they don't have proceedings, they have stakeholder initiatives, and then they make recommendations to the board. And so the stakeholder initiatives we've been active in include resource adequacy enhancements, hybrid resources, which is looking at solar plus storage plants, for example, market enhancements for summer 2021 readiness, so looking at changes in order to ensure there's enough reliability in 2021, maximum import capability enhancements, as well as maximum import capability stabilization and multi-year allocation. So that's all very technical, but our work with them is very important. One of the other things that Kaiso leads is the transmission planning process, which is one that we are also wanting to monitor and ensure that transmission planning is done in a way that enables reliability, even though transmission planning is not really within EBCE's purview. Our ability to serve our customers is dependent on being able to get the energy where it needs to go in California. Next slide, please. All right, so now what we wanted to do is do a deeper dive into some of our most significant CPUC proceedings. These proceedings tend to come up a lot when we give updates to the board at either our board meetings or executive committee meetings, for example. And so we just wanted to go a little bit deeper with you today, make sure we're giving the high-level summary of what these proceedings are about, and answering any questions that you may have about them.
Melissa, this is Dan. Maybe we could invite people to, if they have any questions about the 30,000-foot introductions that you gave to all the agencies. Colleagues, does anybody have any questions on what was presented so far? It's fine to hold the questions, but if there are, feel free to raise your hand. Okay, I'm not seeing any. All right, continue. Thank you, Melissa and team.
Okay, great. Yes, and so I'm actually going to, next slide, please, turn over to Stephanie on our team, who's going to walk you through resource adequacy.
Thanks, Melissa. So resource adequacy was mentioned as one of the areas that the CPUC has oversight over CCAs. It's also a big issue right now in California. So there's a lot of activity right now. So I'll provide some background on the RA program, as we call it, and then we'll also talk about some of the current issues that are getting decided. So the resource adequacy RA program was also created in the aftermath of the energy crisis with the goal of preventing future energy shortages. And the legislation that created the RA program set requirements for the Cpuc to establish obligations of load serving entities under its jurisdiction. Again, in this case, that includes Ccas, to maintain a certain amount of adequate capacity to meet their peak demand, plus a margin, which is referred to here as planning and operating reserves. So the overall goals of the program are to ensure safe and reliable operation of the grid in real time, and also to incentivize the siting and construction of new resources that are needed for future grid reliability. And I'd say that that second goal is one that the existing program structure has sort of fallen a bit short on, and we'll get into that in a couple of slides. Next slide, please. So to give you a sense of what the program is and what those requirements look like for EBCE, all LSEs have 3 different types of RA requirements: system, local, and flexible. So system is that overall peak plus margin. In California, that margin is 15%, and so that's just kind of it's meant to cover the overall system reliability. So if each LSE is has enough to cover their peak and a 15% margin, then as a whole, California, the Kaiso footprint should have enough generation. There's also local RA, and so in local areas are subject to more constraints, transmission constraints, congestion, things like that, that mean you have to ensure a certain level of reliability within these local areas and load pockets. So those requirements are determined by a Kaiso study that's performed annually, and they basically model different scenarios where there are contingency events, and look at the amount of capacity that is needed within each local area in order to maintain reliability during one of those events. And then flexible RA is a bit newer, and this is also established by the Kaiso. And the idea here is to ensure that the capacity resources we have are not only available, but also capable of ramping up and basically providing the flexibility that's needed to maintain a reliable grid when you have diverse resources and high renewable penetration. So the process is that the CEC performs their load forecasts, and the Kaiso uses that to then determine the reliability need, and then the Cpuc takes what the Kaisos come up with and sets each of the individual LSD's compliance requirements. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that the program is facing some issues, and there's in the proceeding, we're actually expecting shortly a proposed decision that would commit to a framework for broader RA program reform. So I think that the goal of that, and sort of why that has come up in the proceeding, is to address some real problems that have come up, such as that the current program isn't really designed to accommodate the level of renewables that California is moving towards, combined with the amount of increased uncertainty there is due to extreme weather events. So Obviously, with climate change, that changes, that we're more likely to experience droughts, heat waves. That has effects both in terms of the supply that's available for California to meet our load, what hydro and renewable resources are capable of generating, and also the load response to that with increases in air conditioning and things like that. There are also shifting regional dynamics. So, California isn't the only state that is experiencing changes in weather. The Northwest had a heat wave at the same time we did last August, which caused some issues. And in addition to that, other states around California are also setting more ambitious clean energy targets of their own, and they're retiring their aging thermal fleet. So essentially that means that there's less of an ability for California to rely on importing power when we have a shortage in state. There's also a lot of discussion right now about energy sufficiency. So, essentially, as California is transitioning to a very high renewable grid, and as the cost of energy storage fall, theoretically, we can be, that the combination of all of those resources can provide adequate capacity, but questions around, will we have enough excess generation from solar in the middle of the day for the storage fleet to be able to fully charge and then discharge later in the evening after the sun has set, or could that storage fleet run out of energy? And so, questions like that are coming up, which are sort of outside of the traditional capacity-based RA framework. In addition to that, there is a shortfall of capacity. So, we experienced blackouts last year. That there were a variety of underlying causes to those blackouts, but it has sort of highlighted kind of how close California is in terms of having adequate capacity online. There are also penalties that are increasing. There's a proposed decision right now and another track of the RA proceeding that changes the penalty structure and can basically the cost of being deficient can multiply for repeat offenders. And this is all happening while there's no waiver. So basically we have a supply shortage and increased penalties, and it makes it it's a very difficult environment for LSUs to comply in. And then finally, our local RA obligations. I mentioned those three types of RA. Local RA is actually being transitioned to a central procurement model. So what that looks like is that PG&E and SCE are the designated central procurement entities for their footprints, and they are tasked with procuring all of the local RA to meet those aggregate requirements. So what that does is basically introduce a lot of uncertainty and risk for EBCE in terms of if we make investments in Alameda County, which is in one of the local RA areas, in order to capture the value of that local RA, we would need to participate in and be selected by this central procurement entity. And there's no guarantees about that. Next slide, please. Actually, but I know that was a lot. Are there any questions on RA before we move to IRP? Okay, great. So the integrated resource planning proceeding is another area where The CPUC has jurisdiction over EBCE. The IRP was established actually by the same legislation that set the 50% RP renewable portfolio standard. That has since been increased to 60% by 2030. But that law included a number of other provisions, one of which is a requirement for the CPUC to establish this process that identifies a diverse and balanced portfolio of resources that provides optimal integration of renewable energy and in a cost-effective manner. That process also has to achieve all of this long list of requirements. So meeting greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, complying with the RPS, just and reasonable rates, minimizing bill impacts, ensuring reliability, strengthening the diversity of the bulk transmission and distribution system, enhancing distribution system and demand side energy management, and minimizing air pollutants with priority on disadvantaged communities. So that's a lot to put into one process. And also that list touches on a number of other proceedings that the CPUC has. So the idea is sort of that the IRP is kind of this umbrella proceeding at the CPUC where inputs from other related proceedings feed into it, and then outputs from the IRP are also kind of feedback down into each of those. In reality, it's probably less coordinated than we'd like, but that's sort of the vision. Next slide, please. So what the process looks like currently is that it's a 2-year planning cycle. 2 years is a bit aspirational. I don't think we've ever gone through. We're in the second cycle, and neither of them have kind of cleanly fit into a 24-month period. But theoretically, in year 1, the commission performs a system-wide modeling exercise that looks at all of the existing resources in Kaiso, looks at the load forecast that the CEC generates, layers on all of the requirements like meeting an RPS, meeting a GHG target, and the RA obligations, and then generates a portfolio that does all of those things at least cost. So they have an optimization model that sort of solves for what that overall portfolio looks like. And that portfolio then feeds down into various other statewide planning exercises, such as when Kaiso is looking at the need for new transmission. The third bullet is also important to note. So just based on that system level modeling alone, the CPUC may decide that new procurement is required. And so they have already done this once, and we have a proposed decision in the IRP proceeding that would require a great deal more new procurement because of anticipated shortages related to Diablo Canyon going offline. In year 2, individual LSEs do their own modeling and planning, long-term planning exercise that shows how they plan to build out their portfolio in a way that meets their greenhouse gas targets and all of the other requirements that they're subject to. So we filed that with the commission. We filed our 2020 IRP in September. And the idea then is that the commission reviews all of those individual plans and then aggregates the information across all of them to get back to that system level view and compares that to that initial optimal portfolio and to ensure that in aggregate the LSCs are planning towards a future that makes sense. We are waiting on that aggregated portfolio, and the first cycle of the IRP was not able to actually use the data from individual IRPs that LSCs filed. So it's a complicated exercise, and the commission attempted to streamline things a little bit more this time, but it's unclear when we'll see that and what that will look like. And like I said, in the meantime, they've moved forward with this proposed new procurement order. Next slide, please. So the big issues that I'll highlight in the IRP space are that because the process is so involved and rigorous, but must also rely on public information to the extent possible, all of those sort of inputs and assumptions that are done in that system level modeling have kind of lagged real-time development. So, by the time we have a reference system plan, everything that we assumed going into it has evolved and changed in ways that affect things sometimes significantly. So, one example of that is on imports. I mentioned that dynamic is changing, and there's the reduced reliability of imports. So, what was assumed in terms of the amount of energy that imports could provide and capacity, actually imports can help us meet our RA obligations, is different than kind of what we're seeing in the market. So that's all happening at a time when we have this capacity shortfall looming. And so, we have this planning process that is pretty disjointed from the kind of near midterm procurement needs. And what that's meant is that the Cpuc has had to issue these emergency procurement orders that tell LSCs how much to build and by when, and that are kind of divorced from all of this modeling and analysis and all of the work that individual LSCs did to develop their IRPs. So, like I mentioned, big new thing here is this 11,500 megawatts of RA capacity by 2026 was proposed, and that's a lot. And I think we're seeing kind of a number of themes from like the RA space and an IRP come together, and just a lot of kind of anxiety around having sufficient capacity, and so the commission doesn't want to issue an order and then have that not be enough. So I think that's my last slide, and I believe Todd is next.
Should we take another quick pause for questions here?
Yeah.
Yes, we have one question from Cynthia Laundrie. I'm going to recognize Cynthia Laundrie for 1 minute.
Okay. Yes, thank you. What I wanted to ask about is, you said that PG&E and I believe Southern Edison will be purchasing renewable energy. And I'm just, I know this is something you'll be developing more closely, but how would that affect our local business development plan, and specifically, building alternative renewable resources within Alameda County, please?
Yeah, it's a great question. We advocated for a more residual model that would have allowed for EBCE to procure its own local RA, and for a central entity to, if there was a shortfall, to kind of step in and fill that gap. Unfortunately, that's not what we ended up with. This is only for, our local RA obligation. So, EBCE is still, investing in its portfolio of resources, and that includes an emphasis on, local and distributed resources. I don't know if Melissa or Nick want to say any more about that.
I mean, I guess the only thing I would say is, yes, it erodes the value proposition of investing in local resources that might have had RA value, because we can no longer kind of claim that value. And it's part of why we have been working with the CEC on an alternative model, so that we can actually modify our load by using distributed energy resources, so that we end up with less of an RA obligation. And that's kind of another way to go about solving the problem, since we weren't able to get a satisfactory solution from the Cpuc. We've had to be creative and look for alternative solutions to maintain that value. But it's an ongoing struggle. I don't think that the Cpuc shares our interest in local investments. They are really taking a statewide perspective, and they tend to take a IOU-centric procurement perspective. And so that's one of the challenges that we have to deal with constantly.
Mr. Chair, I have a question, and I don't see the raise hand feature on my computer. I'm not sure if that's available or not. If I may ask a question.
I'll take over, assuming Chair Kalb had to step away, and I'll recognize the member from Newark, member Hand.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not seeing the raised hand feature, so I apologize for that. I'm assuming that we will meet our RA capacity in 2026, but let's assume for one moment that we don't meet that requirement. Would we then be subject to those penalties? And if so, what would those penalties look like?
Yeah, so this is, so the procurement that is being required in the IRP proceeding is for RA capacity, but it is separate from the RA program requirements. So then there are penalties associated with being deficient for both of those. So for the IRP procurement order, if we fall short of meeting our share of the procurement that's required, we have to both, well, the proposal is that the cost of doing backstop procurement, which would be done by the IOUs, that would, we would have to cover those costs that would flow back to us, and in addition to a penalty that is based on the basically based on the capacity cost of energy storage. So they're kind of stacking those two on top of each other, saying not only if you don't meet your requirement, not only do you have to cover the cost of someone else filling that in for you, but you also have to pay this penalty, which is kind of tied to what the cost of new capacity would be.
And then my quick follow-up question, the RA capacity increase by 2026, did that come as an incredible surprise to us? Were we anticipating such an increase in RA capacity? And if so, or if not, was there conversation with the Cpuc prior to the establishing of those capacity goals that kind of gave us some insight as to what their thought process was? Thank you.
Yeah, so we have known for a little while that this was coming. Essentially, there was this initial, the 3,300 megawatts was issued in 2019. And then, kind of it didn't take very long then for the commission and kind of the other agencies, Kaiso has been really concerned about this, to realize that that was likely not enough to actually cover our shortfall, and certainly not with the retirement of Diablo Canyon. We've known about that retirement for a long time. It has been included in all of the modeling for a long time, but there are a number of other assumptions and like imports and things that kind of hid kind of maybe the scale of the issue. And then in addition to that, I think that the commission is just worried that unless they do an order like this, they won't see the amount of capacity needed in time. So they're trying to sort of get in front of that and avoid having to, in 2023, having to do another kind of very short-term emergency procurement order. So the order itself was not a surprise. The magnitude was quite a bit higher than what was kind of initially proposed and what most of the modeling shows. So the initial proposal has 7,500 megawatts, and then just to sort of bound that, Southern California Edison did their own modeling, and they saw a deficiency of more like around 5,000. The California ISO was more in the 10,000 range. And then the commission essentially, think there are, given the sort of heightened anxiety about having enough capacity, they went with this, more conservative assumptions. And so the top line number was more than we were expecting.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I think we can move along.
All right, next slide, please. And here I'm going to turn it over to Todd on our team.
Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to lead off here by talking about the power charge indifference adjustment, or PCIA, which is actually super important for us as an organization for a variety of reasons. It tends to be a big driver of our competitiveness relative to PG&E, and has been the source of a number of disputes amongst the CCAs and the IUs and the Cpuc over the years. So I'll give you a brief historical overview of kind of where it comes from, what it is, and then talk a little bit about where we would like it to go, and then dive into some of the ongoing methodological issues that we're seeing in the various annual filings that relate to it. So to start off with where does it come from? The PCIA is the PUC's attempt to implement requirements from the CCA enabling legislation, AB 117, that basically requires CCA customers to pay for legacy procurement that IUs made on their behalf, in the expectation that they would remain IU customers, in which the IUs are still on the hook for even after the CCA customers leave. And I highlighted one instance of the relevant language here from what's now in PU Code section 366.2. It also reflects the PUC's attempt to implement various prohibitions on cost shifting amongst bundled, remaining IU customers and departed customers who leave for CCA service. So that's the source of the PCIA from the statutory side. The way the PUC has implemented the PCIA beginning back in 2018 is to have it as a charge, it's a rate that's applicable to all customers. So there's a tendency to shorthand PCIA as an exit fee. It actually isn't. At one point it was, but it's not anymore. It's now a surcharge, essentially a non-bypassable charge imposed on all customers. And so that's the world in which we're living. Next slide, please. Okay, so the PCI as it's currently structured is, got it identified here as a mark-to-market. The idea is that you look at what the market costs were, or excuse me, the market prices were for the various elements that make up the PCI portfolio, and use those to put a value on what's in the portfolio. And then you compare that value to what it costs to have the portfolio. And the costs, in turn, come from, in the case of the things that the utility owns, the Diablo Canyons and Gateway projects of the world, utility-owned generation. Those costs come generally from the GRC, general rate case. For the things that the utility is contracted for, the long-term power purchase agreements with things like the Ivanpah Generation Station or the Tracy Cogen or what have you, those come from the contracts that the utility has signed. So what you're doing with the PCIA is you're essentially toting up all of the things on the value side, then independently you're toting up all of the things on the cost side. The issue that we've been having, and I've bolded this here at the bottom of the slide, is we don't think that the mechanisms the PUC is set up to capture the value are in fact adequately capturing the value on the portfolio side. And so while conceptually it's all very neat and pretty, in practice, we think it's materially understating the value of the portfolio. And that's been an ongoing source of litigation amongst ourselves and the PUC, and looks likely to continue to be in the wake of their most recent PCIA decision. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the most recent PUC decision. So part of what we on the CCA side have been trying to do to kind of reduce the conflict around the valuation is we've been trying to simply get the assets out of the portfolio and into our own hands. If we're getting the assets kind of how they're valued matters less, because we're getting them on the same terms as the bundled customers. And so we had undertaken an effort to put together a proposal along with, as you'll see here on the bottom bullet here, along with the investor-owned utilities and also direct access electric service provider, commercial energy, to develop a proposal that would essentially allocate the resources in the portfolio to all LSCs on an equal footing, which would have mitigated a lot of the fights we've been having around PCIA. And unfortunately, last month, the PUC turned down much of that proposal. They did, however, one, continue to allow for, in fact, require, in the case of Southern California Edison, allocation of greenhouse gas-free electricity. So we'll continue to have the option to take a slug of hydroelectric and or nuclear going forward through 2023, while the PUC figures out what it wants to do on a long-term basis with the GHG-free. The PUC did provide for an allocation of the RPS resources. There's a bunch of asterisks and caveats around that, which I won't dive down into here, but at least in broad brushstrokes, we got some of what we were looking for there. But we will not get an allocation of the resource adequacy. And as Stephanie just went through, resource adequacy is hard to come by now, and that's an unfortunate outcome for us. Would have been very helpful to get that. Next slide, please. So where the PCIA actually gets operationalized, where this conceptual structure I was talking about earlier, where you compare the costs and the value and you subtract the two, and then you take that difference and turn it into a rate, where that happens is in the ERA proceedings, or the ERA proceedings. And these are annual proceedings, and there are two of them that we have filed by PG&E. There's an ERA forecast, and so the forecast is where the utility sets the rate for the following year. So in this year, 2021, June 1st, we saw PG&E file its 2022 ERA forecast proceeding. And then there's a backward-looking proceeding where you look at kind of everything that went into the prior year's ERA, and subject to a fairly light regulatory touch, get to make some arguments about whether PG&E did a good or bad job with managing the elements of its portfolio. That's the ERA compliance proceeding. So the forecast is filed in June. And then as we get closer to the year in which that forecast numbers will actually become rates, we get an update. I mentioned here the November update. That's the biggest one. In practice, we often see incremental updates both before and after the November update, but November is kind of the nominal final stop before you get to your full rates. And then error compliance is filed in March. It proceeds on a slower track because again, it's purely backward looking. So its forward looking effects will get rolled into the following year's error forecast if anything changes as a result of that proceeding. So we're active in both of these proceedings. Because the PCI has been something of a moving target, the error forecast has been contentious as we've tried to get the new the 2018 methodology implemented. There have been a lot of deep in the weeds questions where PG&E, as we say in the contract realm, has drafted for advantage. As the filer, if there are any close calls, they get to kind of make the initial cut at which way something should fall. And we found numerous instances where they were doing things that turned out not to be appropriate and have clawed back hundreds of millions of dollars in that process. So the error forecast has been very important. Error compliance, we're active there as well. Less available in the way of dollars, but usually anywhere from tens to potentially hundreds of millions of dollars are available there as we peruse PG&E's practices and take issue with some or all of what we're finding. So those are the annual proceedings that we have to deal with. And again, those are the way that we operationalize the sort of policy pronouncements that are coming out of the broader PCIA proceeding. Next slide, please. Yeah, I think we already stepped through all of this. So let's go on. Next slide. Okay, so let me pause before we turn to direct access and see if anyone had any questions about PCI. Again, very high level discussion here. Diana, see you've got your hand raised, or maybe Dan, you're one who calls folks.
Yeah, I know. I do have a question. So I'm just, thank you for the great work that you're doing in the error proceedings. And I'm just wondering, are we engaging directly as an agency, or are we doing that through our membership in CalCCA?
Well, I guess neither. The error proceedings are not CalCCA proceedings because they're utility specific. But we engage as part of what we call a coalition of the willing. So all of in our case, all of the CCAs in PG&E's footprint band together and jointly share costs in order to defray the litigation expense of the error proceeding. I am one of the 3 CCA people who are the co-leads for that proceeding. So, we as EBC do have a significant say in how that litigation is handled, but it is as part of a coalition.
Great, I appreciate that. I know we're firing on all cylinders in every direction with all these regulatory agencies. So thank you for that clarification.
Yep. Were there any further questions on PCI? Everybody's got it?
No more hands raised, so feel free to.
Okay, so let's move on to direct access. So direct access is kind of a legacy of the failed California restructuring from back in 1996, maybe 1890, the legislation that brought us the energy crisis of 2000, 2001. Notwithstanding that the legislature froze direct access in AB1X back in 2000, 2001, folks who had kind of gotten back onto direct access before the door closed with AB1X continued to take service from their electric service provider, their ESP. And since 2001, the legislature has twice now expanded essentially the number of megawatts that can be served via direct access as opposed to via IOUs or CCAs. So ESPs are competitors for both IOUs and CCAs. And for the last 2 years, we've been wrestling with how to implement the legislature's most recent DA expansion. That's the third bullet point here, SB 237. So SB 237 did 2 things. One is it opened up direct access to a specified number of megawatts, and left it to the PUC how to roll that out. That expansion was rolled out over 2 years, but it also invited the PUC to make some recommendations about further expansion of direct access. And so just last month, the PUC issued a proposed decision, which will be up for vote this month, on whether to expand direct access or not. As noted in the second bullet point, ESPs are I mean, they're a mixed bag, right? There's a fair number of them. They kind of run the gamut from the commercial energies of the world to the UC system. So it's sort of difficult to generalize about them, but a lot of them have some problematic track records on reliability and environmental issues, both whether they comply and how they comply. And so the PUC's recommendation to the legislature, at least as framed in a staff report and now in this proposed decision set for vote, is that the legislature not expand direct access any further. And they pinned that decision primarily on the challenges that we had last summer with reliability, tied it into the experience that Texas had this winter. Texas is, of course, fully deregulated, and their customers are served essentially only by ESPs. And said, you know, we're not confident that if we expand, if you, the legislature, expand direct access, that we'll be able to satisfy the criteria that you put in SB 237 as essentially threshold requirements for any DA expansion. So don't. You know, we'll see what happens with that. Reply comments are due tomorrow on the proposed decision. Obviously, the direct access advocates have come in strong, urging that the PD not be voted out as it is. So we shall see where that lands. Let's see, next slide. Okay, so I think that's it for me. Unless there were any questions about direct access, I'll turn it back over to Melissa. I think Bob got back some time there too. Oh, all right, well, thank you, everybody. Appreciate you taking the time this afternoon.
All right, thanks, Todd. So that concludes the regulatory overview. I did want to talk a little bit about legislative as well. And so just as a reminder, our legislative program that the board has adopted guides EBCE's legislative priorities and stances, and it outlines 3 major legislative priorities, which are accelerating decarbonization, promoting local development, and stabilizing community choice. We have some additional priorities that are spelled out, policy positions, but these are kind of the 3 guiding priorities that we look to when we are analyzing legislation. I will also mention that I have reached out to each of our member jurisdictions to determine who the best legislative person is among each jurisdiction, so that we can maintain regular communications. We can, of course, be a resource to our members for energy legislation as our cities are analyzing legislation that comes their way, and a technical resource to answer questions. We also just want to make sure that we're staying coordinated. We don't want to be in a position where we're taking a different view on a piece of legislation than our cities, if we can avoid that. So that's something we're trying to just be better coordinated on, and we're now regularly communicating so that we can maintain those relationships. And also, as a reminder, we're contracted at the moment with Weideman Group for our state legislative advocacy. Oh, I think we just went back. There we go. And so they are based in Sacramento. And I work very closely with our legislative advocacy folks to maintain our communications with legislators in Sacramento. Next slide, please. So I wanted to highlight the key legislative committees and EBCE's delegation. There are 2 committees that are probably the most important for us and for the legislation that we are following. On the Assembly side, it's the Utilities and Energy Committee. On the Senate side, it's the Energy, Utilities, and Communications Committee. We do have some delegation committee members on each of those. On the Assembly side, it's Assembly Member Bauer-Kayan and Assembly Member Quirk. And then on the Senate side, it is Senator Eggman. Senator Skinner used to be on that committee, but she was reassigned to become the budget chair. And in doing so, she's no longer on the Senate committee, which is good that she's the budget chair, but too bad that we lost one of our delegation members on a key committee. So I've listed here all of our Assembly delegation and Senate delegation. We have 5 Assembly members representing EBCE's service area. Rob Bonta, of course, is his seat is currently vacant. There's a special election to fill that role, so we will have a new Assembly member to meet soon. And then on the Senate side, oh, and I should mention, when we also gained 2 more members. So on the Assembly side, it's Assembly Member Via Padua. On the Senate side, we gained Senator Eggman. And then it's also just worth noting that Senator Skinner is a Senate Budget Committee Chair and Senator Wajkowski is a Senate Budget Subcommittee Chair. And so as budget items are going forward, it's helpful to have our delegation on those key committees. Next slide, please.
Melissa, I think minor mistake. I think you left off Assemblymember Buffy Wicks on the Assembly side there.
Oh, you're right. Thank you for pointing that out. I did. My apologies to Assemblymember Wicks. Yes, you're right. I thought we had 6. I was wondering why I was counting 5 there. I will make sure to fix that. She is definitely one of our Assembly members. She is not on the committee, however. So just real quick, wanted to highlight, we've been highlighting at recent board meetings our bill positions and providing status updates. So I've just put this up here again. As we continue to track bills, we will continue to provide updates to the board. We have also just put our bill tracker up on EBCE's website. So it's a little bit easier to access for anybody who wants to see it. There's a new page that's called Legislative Priorities, and it actually links to both our legislative program as well as our bill tracker. So that can be found at any time and will be updated regularly. In any case, I think there were a number of bills we were supporting that did not pass out of their House of Origin and are now considered 2-year bills, can't be acted upon until January. And so I'm now listing here the bills that have in fact been adopted. I would note in that AB 1139, which is one of the bills we were looking at, did not pass off of the Assembly floor. So that's also not listed here. And next slide is just the same thing for the Senate side. So again, I think you've seen these slides before, but just to remind you that this is kind of how we're tracking the bills that we're following. I think it's worth noting that SB 612 did quite well in its Senate vote and is now pending committee referral in the Assembly, which is its second house. We're assuming it will go to the Assembly Utilities and Energy Committee soon. And at this point, we are seeking all the member jurisdictions that sent in support letters to send in a new support letter to the Assembly Committee. Next slide, please. So I'm happy to take any questions about legislation, and then we can move to strategic communications.
Not seeing any hands raised. You can continue.
Okay. Great. So as I mentioned, we also work with a consultant to develop strategic communications, particularly from the CEO's Desk blog and e-newsletter, which is sent out about quarterly. And the goal here is really to write articles that highlight some of our endeavors and our successes, to also profile board members and staff, and to also provide results of some interesting and relevant data analyses and recent news clips involving EBCE. The goal here is really to just ensure that folks that we're working with know what we're doing. I think one of the things we were hearing a lot was that because, for example, the CPUC doesn't regulate a lot of what we do, they weren't very aware of a lot of what we do. I think the same thing goes for the legislature. They allowed us to be formed. They knew we were up and running, but they weren't really getting necessarily updates about all the great things that we are doing. And so we wanted to make sure to maintain that communications channel. And this has proved to be a fairly effective way to do that. We've had some pretty high readership rates and very low opt-outs from the subscriptions. And so we continue to do this work to make sure we're highlighting the interesting successes that we have. And I think it's been quite successful. Next slide, please. So that really concludes our presentation today. And again, happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you, Melissa. Colleagues, if you want to use the raise hand feature to be recognized, now would be time to do so. It was a lot to digest. So if you've been holding any questions, you can go ahead and ask at this time. All right, we understood everything 100%. So I'm not seeing any hands raised, but of course, colleagues, you're always welcome to reach out to staff directly if you have any questions on the many, many topics that were covered today. And I'm sure this meeting will be available online as a recorded meeting if you need to refer to it in the future. So at this time, I will turn to public comment. And for members of the public, if you're using Zoom, please use the raise hand feature available in the app. If you're calling in, please press *9. And in the interest of time, because we do have a closed session we need to enter into, I'm going to allot 1 minute for public speakers. So I will check in with the board clerk and see if anyone has submitted a speaker card.
There are no speaker cards for this item.
All right, and I'm looking to the attendees list and I see no raised hands. So thank you. I will close public comment at this time. And then I'm going to take one thing a bit out of order. I'd like to provide a moment for board members and staff announcements, including requests to place items on future board agendas. If anyone has any announcements at this time, I just want to offer that before we adjourn into closed sessions. Anyone have any announcements or future agenda requests? All right, seeing none, I'm going to actually turn to our clerk. Sorry to put you on the spot, but if you have any special directions on everyone getting to the closed session, could you please share them with the board at this time?
Yes, I'm going to send out the invitation to the Google Meet to all of the board members. If you are an alternate and you wish to attend the closed session as the voting member, please let me know. Please send me an email. And otherwise, the closed session is scheduled to begin at 3:15. I'm going to send the invitation out. I'm going to email the invitation out at the conclusion of this meeting.
Okay, very good. And then will we be coming back to this Zoom address to report out?
No, we're just going to go ahead and adjourn this meeting and then go to the closed session.
So there's no report out of our closed session?
We can return to this to do the closeout.
Yeah, let's at least you and me, and if we have Nick on the line as well. And
yep, I'm here.
Great, Nick, and then
Do the report out, yes.
But if at least the three of us return and report out of closed session onto recording, just to make sure that we tie everything together. But we'll use this same Zoom address to report out of closed session at the end of closed session, if any member of the public wishes to stay on the line for who knows how long we'll be in there, but who wishes to see us report out. We'll be doing it at this same address. Okay, so thank you, colleagues. The time is 2:55, so we've got a 20-minute break before we'll be expected to be in the closed session, and we'll see you there. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Great, thank you.
Hey.
Yes.
Oh, there you go.
Okay.
All right, there are no members of the public in the attendees list, correct, Adrian?
No, there's no one here except for us. There's no one here on the attendee list.
Okay, well, just for the record, in that case, we're back from closed session and reporting out. And I just lost my agenda. We are reporting out on the closed session item, conference with real property negotiators under California Government Code Section 54956.8 regarding the property 251 8th Street, Oakland, California, 94607. And there are no reportable actions made at this meeting. So that is so deemed. And
Great.
we adjourn this meeting.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.